Margaret Rose had dreamed of this day since she was a little girl. Like every woman, she had imagined walking down the aisle in a beautiful white dress, surrounded by family and friends who would cry happy tears and celebrate her special moment. But as she stood in front of the old church mirror that Saturday morning, adjusting her custom-made wedding dress for the 10th time, she felt her stomach twist into knots that had nothing to do with wedding day nerves. The dress had taken 3 fittings and cost more than most people spent on their entire wedding. Finding a beautiful gown in her size had been nearly impossible in their small town. The local bridal shop owner had made it clear that ordering her dress would be a special favor, speaking in hushed tones as if Margaret's size was some kind of shameful secret that needed to be whispered about. Through the thin walls of the church's small dressing room, she could already hear the guests arriving. The sound of car doors slamming, heels clicking on the stone steps, and most painfully the voices. Even though they thought they were being quiet, Margaret could catch fragments of conversations that made her heart sink. "I still can't believe Thomas is actually going through with this. Poor boy. He's always been too kind for his own good. Did you see the size of that dress when they delivered it? The seamstress must have used half a fabric store." Margaret's best friend since childhood, Lisa, noticed her hands shaking as she tried to put on her pearl earrings. "Hey, don't listen to them," Lisa whispered, gently taking the earrings and helping her put them on. "You look absolutely beautiful. Thomas is the luckiest man alive." But Margaret could see the worry in Lisa's eyes, too. Even her closest friends seemed nervous about what people would say. The whole town had been talking about this wedding for months. Not because it was romantic or exciting, but because everyone seemed shocked that someone like Thomas would marry someone like her. Thomas worked at the local lumber yard and had the kind of rugged, good looks that made mothers point him out to their single daughters. He was tall, strong from years of physical work, and had the kind of easy smile that made everyone feel comfortable around him. Margaret, on the other hand, had been heavy her entire life. She worked as a secretary at the town hall and lived quietly, trying not to draw attention to herself. When Thomas had first asked her out 2 years ago, she thought it was some kind of joke. They had known each other since high school, but he had dated the pretty, popular girls while she watched from the sidelines. But Thomas had been genuine. He took her to dinner, brought her flowers, and seemed to actually enjoy her company. For the first time in her life, someone saw past her appearance and appreciated her quick wit, her love of old movies, and the way she could make him laugh until his sides hurt. The church bells began to ring, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Margaret's father appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in his old suit. He had never been good with emotions, and today seemed especially difficult for him. "You ready, sweetheart?" he asked, but his voice lacked the enthusiasm she had hoped for. She could tell he was worried about what people would think. Her whole family seemed to be walking on eggshells, as if they were all just trying to get through the day without too much embarrassment. As they walked toward the church doors, Margaret could hear the organ music beginning. The traditional wedding march that should have filled her with joy instead made her feel like she was walking toward some kind of judgment. She knew that every person in those pews would be watching her, analyzing her appearance, and probably wondering what Thomas was thinking. The doors opened, and there he was. Thomas stood at the altar in his simple black suit, and when he saw her, his face lit up with the most genuine smile she had ever seen. For a moment, all the whispers and doubts faded away. This man loved her. This wonderful, kind man had chosen her, and that had to count for something. But as she walked down the aisle, she couldn't ignore the faces in the crowd. Some people tried to smile politely, but she could see the surprise and judgment in their eyes. Thomas's mother sat in the front row, her lips pressed together in a thin line that barely qualified as a smile. His sister kept glancing around nervously, as if she was embarrassed to be associated with the whole event. The whispers weren't even subtle anymore. Margaret could hear bits and pieces of conversations as she passed each row. "That poor dress is working overtime. I give it 6 months before he realizes what a mistake this is. She must have some kind of hold on him. Maybe she's pregnant." The last comment stung the most because Margaret knew how much Thomas wanted children. They had talked about starting a family right away, and she desperately wanted to give him the sons and daughters he dreamed about. But even that dream felt tainted by people's assumptions about why he would marry her. When she finally reached the altar, Thomas took her hands in his and squeezed them gently. He leaned close and whispered, "You look absolutely perfect." His words were meant to comfort her, but she could see that he had heard the whispers too. There was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there during their rehearsal dinner. The minister began the ceremony, but Margaret found it hard to focus on the words. She kept noticing people in the congregation checking their watches, shifting in their seats, and exchanging glances with each other. This was supposed to be the most important day of her life, but it felt like everyone was just waiting for it to be over when it came time for the vows. Thomas spoke his words with such sincerity that Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. He promised to love her in sickness and health, for better or worse, and she could tell he meant every word. But when she tried to speak her own vows, her voice cracked with emotion, not just from love, but from the overwhelming weight of everyone's doubt pressing down on her shoulders. The reception was held in the church's fellowship hall, decorated with simple white flowers and candles that Margaret had arranged herself. She had spent weeks planning every detail, hoping to create a celebration that would show everyone how happy and normal their love was. But even during the dinner, she could feel the judgment continuing. People approached their table to offer congratulations, but the words felt hollow and forced. "Best wishes for your future together," they would say, but their eyes told a different story. Some guests left early, claiming they had other commitments. Others clustered in small groups, clearly talking about the wedding couple but falling silent whenever Margaret walked by. The worst moment came during the dancing. Thomas led her onto the floor for their first dance as husband and wife, and she could feel every eye in the room watching them. Someone had turned down the music slightly, and in the relative quiet, she heard a woman say, "Well, at least he's strong enough to hold her up." That night, as they drove to the small cabin where they would spend their honeymoon weekend, Margaret finally broke down. All the hurt and humiliation she had been holding back came pouring out in tears. Thomas pulled the car over and held her while she sobbed. "I'm so sorry," she cried. "I ruined your wedding day. Everyone thinks you made a terrible mistake." Thomas lifted her chin and looked into her eyes. "Margaret Rose, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. I don't care what anyone else thinks. We're going to have a beautiful life together. And someday everyone will see what I already know. You have the biggest heart in this whole town." But as they continued toward their honeymoon cabin, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow failed before their marriage had even truly begun. The whispers and stares had planted seeds of doubt that she feared would only grow stronger with time. 2 years had passed since that difficult wedding day, and Margaret had hoped that time would heal the wounds left by all those cruel whispers. She and Thomas had settled into their small house on Maple Street, and for a while life felt almost normal. Thomas would leave for work at the lumber yard each morning with a kiss and a smile, and Margaret would head to her job at the town hall, where she had learned to ignore the occasional stares and comments. But their greatest dream remained just out of reach. Every month brought the same crushing disappointment. Margaret would find herself crying in the bathroom at work, another pregnancy test showing just one line instead of the two that would have changed everything. She had started buying the tests in the next town over because she couldn't bear the pitying looks from the pharmacist who had known her since childhood. The first time she got pregnant, they were over the moon. Thomas actually danced around their tiny kitchen, spinning Margaret until they both got dizzy and collapsed onto the couch, laughing and making plans for the nursery. They told their families right away, too excited to wait. But at 8 weeks, Margaret woke up to cramping and bleeding that sent them rushing to the emergency room in the middle of the night. The doctor, an older man with kind eyes, explained that miscarriages were more common than people realized. "These things happen," he said gently. "You're young and healthy. There's no reason you can't try again." But Margaret felt like her body had betrayed not just her but Thomas too, the second. Pregnancy lasted 12 weeks. They had been more cautious this time, waiting until they heard the heartbeat before telling anyone. Margaret had even started looking at baby clothes in the store windows, imagining Thomas teaching their child to ride a bike or helping with homework at the kitchen table. When she lost that baby too, the grief felt even heavier because she had allowed herself to hope. After the third miscarriage, the doctors started running tests. Margaret spent weeks going from one appointment to another, having blood drawn and undergoing procedures that left her feeling poked and prodded like a science experiment. The fertility specialist, a woman who spoke in clinical terms that made everything sound cold and mechanical, finally delivered the news that shattered their world. "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "Your hormone levels indicate that carrying a pregnancy to term will be extremely difficult, if not impossible. We could try some treatments, but I want to be realistic about your chances." Margaret remembered staring at the diploma on the wall behind the doctor's desk, thinking about how this woman had probably delivered the same devastating news to hundreds of couples. For her, it was just another day at work. For Margaret and Thomas, it was the death of every dream they had built together. The hormone treatments that followed were brutal. The injections made Margaret sick to her stomach, and the medications caused her to gain even more weight. Every morning she would look in the mirror and see her body changing in ways that made her feel even more disconnected from herself. The treatments were expensive too, draining their savings account that they had been building for their future children's college fund. Thomas never complained about the money or the emotional roller coaster they were riding together. But Margaret could see the sadness in his eyes when they passed the playground at the park, or when his friends talked about their kids' soccer games and school plays. She began to feel like she was not just failing as a woman, but as a wife. The worst part was how the town seemed to take notice of their struggles. In a small community, everyone knew everyone else's business, and Margaret's weight gain from the treatments became another source of gossip. She overheard conversations at the grocery store that made her want to disappear. "Poor Thomas," she heard Mrs. Johnson say to her friend while they stood in the produce aisle. "He's such a good man, and look what he's stuck with. She's gotten even bigger, if that's possible." "I heard they've been trying to have kids for years," the friend replied. "Maybe it's nature's way of saying some people shouldn't reproduce." Margaret abandoned her shopping cart and rushed out of the store, tears streaming down her face. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to compose herself before going home to face Thomas. How could she tell him what she had heard? How could she admit that maybe the cruel voices were right? The depression crept in slowly at first, like a fog rolling in on a quiet morning. Margaret started calling in sick to work more often, claiming headaches or stomach problems. The truth was, she couldn't bear the thought of facing people who saw her as a failure. She would spend entire days in her pajamas, moving from the couch to the kitchen and back again. Cooking became her escape. If she couldn't create life, she could at least create elaborate meals that filled their house with wonderful smells and gave her hands something to do. She would spend hours making dishes that could feed a family of 8, even though it was just her and Thomas. Their freezer filled up with casseroles and desserts that they couldn't possibly eat. Thomas tried to understand, but Margaret could see the worry in his eyes. He would come home from work to find her surrounded by cookbooks and dirty dishes, having spent the day making enough food for a small army. He never complained about the mess or the fact that she was barely leaving the house, but she knew he was scared. She was scared too. Their friends stopped inviting them to gatherings where children would be present. At first, Margaret thought they were being considerate, trying to spare her pain. But eventually she realized that people were uncomfortable around her sadness. Her grief made others feel awkward, so it was easier to just leave her out. The house began to feel like a prison. Margaret would spend hours staring out the kitchen window, watching neighbors walk by with their strollers and children on bicycles. Each happy family that passed felt like a reminder of what she couldn't have, what she couldn't give Thomas. One particularly dark day, she found herself standing in what should have been the nursery. They had never quite finished setting it up after the third miscarriage, and it had become a storage room filled with boxes and unused furniture. But in the corner sat the rocking chair that Thomas had bought after their first positive pregnancy test. He had put it together himself, sanding it smooth and painting it white, talking excitedly about rocking their baby to sleep. Margaret sat in that chair and cried harder than she had in months. She felt like she was drowning in her own inadequacy, and she couldn't see any way to swim back to the surface. The woman who had once been confident enough to work in public, who had made Thomas laugh every day, seemed to be disappearing completely. That evening, when Thomas came home and found her still in the rocking chair, he knelt down beside her and took her hands. "We're going to get through this," he said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but we will. You're still the woman I fell in love with, and that hasn't changed." But Margaret wasn't sure she believed him anymore. Looking at her reflection in the bedroom mirror that night, she saw a woman who had gained 50 pounds, whose eyes looked hollow and defeated, who couldn't even manage to get dressed most days. She wondered if Thomas was starting to regret choosing her, if he was beginning to understand what all those wedding guests had been whispering about as she lay in bed listening to Thomas sleep peacefully beside her. Margaret made a decision. Tomorrow she would take a walk. Just a short one, maybe to the end of their street and back. She needed to start somewhere, even if she didn't know where that somewhere would lead her. That walk Margaret had promised herself turned into something she never expected. What started as a simple trip to the end of her street became a daily routine that slowly pulled her out of the dark hole she had been living in. Each day she walked a little further, breathing in the fresh air and trying to remember what it felt like to be part of the world again. It was during one of these walks, about 3 weeks into her new routine, that she first noticed the boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, standing outside Miller's bakery with his face pressed against the glass window. His clothes were too big for his small frame, and his shoes had holes that let the rain soak through to his socks. Margaret watched as the little boy dug into his pockets and pulled out a handful of coins, mixed with what looked like bottle caps, and a few buttons. He walked into the bakery with the confidence of someone who believed his treasure was real money. Through the window she could see him talking to Mr. Miller, pointing at the fresh bread while holding up his collection of odds and ends. Mr. Miller's face grew red with irritation. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she could see him shaking his head and waving his hands, clearly telling the boy to leave. The child's shoulders slumped as he walked back outside, his make-believe money clutched tightly in his small fist. Something about the scene broke Margaret's heart in a way that felt different from her own pain. This wasn't about what she couldn't have anymore. This was about a child who needed help right now, today, in this moment. Without thinking, she crossed the street and approached the boy. "Hi there," she said gently, crouching down to his level. "I'm Margaret. What's your name?" The boy looked up at her with big brown eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "I'm Joey," he said quietly. "I was trying to buy bread, but the man said my money isn't real money." Margaret's heart squeezed tight. "Where do you live, Joey? Are your parents nearby?" "I live at the big house on Hill Street," he said, pointing toward the edge of town. "Mrs. Peterson says we can't bother people for food, but I was so hungry and the bread smelled so good." Margaret knew exactly which house he meant. The old Victorian mansion on Hill Street had been converted into an orphanage years ago, though. Most people in town tried not to think about it too much. It was easier to pretend those children didn't exist than to face the reality of kids who had nowhere else to go. "Well, Joey," Margaret said, standing up and taking his small hand in hers, "I think we can fix this problem. Let's go get you some. Real bread, and maybe some soup to go with it." The boy's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? But I don't have real money." "That's okay," Margaret said, already walking toward the bakery. "I do." When they walked back into Miller's bakery together, Mr. Miller's expression changed completely. He probably wasn't a bad man, just someone who didn't want to deal with children who couldn't pay. But seeing Margaret with Joey seemed to remind him that these were real kids with real needs. Margaret bought 2 loaves of fresh bread, some cheese, and a container of soup that was still warm. She also grabbed a small chocolate chip cookie and handed it to Joey, who looked at it like she had given him a bar of gold. As they walked toward Hill Street, Joey chattered about everything and nothing. He told her about the other kids at the house, about how Mrs. Peterson tried her best but was always tired, and about how they weren't supposed to ask people in town for help because it made folks uncomfortable. Some of the kids say the town. People don't like us, Joey said matter-of-factly, swinging the bag of bread as they walked. They say we remind them of sad things, so they pretend we're not here. The simple honesty of his words hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. How many times had she driven past that house without giving a second thought to the children inside? How many people in town did the same thing every single day? When they reached the orphanage, Margaret was shocked by what she saw. The building was beautiful in its bones, with tall windows and ornate woodwork that spoke of better days. But the paint was peeling, several windows were boarded up, and the front steps looked like they might collapse under too much weight. This was where 12 children called home. Mrs. Peterson answered the door looking frazzled and exhausted. She was probably only in her 50s, but she looked much older, with gray hair pulled back in a messy bun and clothes that had seen better days. When she saw Joey with Margaret, her face filled with worry. "Oh no," she said immediately. "Joey, I told you not to bother people in town. I'm so sorry, ma'am. He didn't mean any harm." "He didn't bother me at all," Margaret said quickly. "In fact, he helped me more than he knows. I brought some food for everyone." Mrs. Peterson's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the bags Margaret was carrying. "That's so kind of you, but we can't accept charity. The state gives us what we need." Margaret could see past Mrs. Peterson into the house, where children of various ages were gathered around a small television with a cracked screen. They were all too thin, wearing clothes that didn't fit properly, and the house smelled like something was wrong with the plumbing. "It's not charity," Margaret said firmly. "I made too much soup at home, and I hate to see food go to waste. Would you be doing me a favor by taking it off my hands?" It was a small lie, but one that allowed Mrs. Peterson to accept the help without feeling ashamed. Margaret could see the relief in the older woman's eyes as she stepped aside to let them. The inside of the house was clean but obviously falling apart. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and several light fixtures hung at odd angles. But what struck Margaret most was how quiet the children were. They watched her with curious eyes but didn't come running over like normal kids might. These children had learned not to expect much from adults, especially adults from town. Mrs. Peterson introduced Margaret to the group, and slowly the children began to warm up to her presence. There was 10-year-old Beth, who took care of the younger ones like a little mother. 14-year-old David, who was angry at the world and showed it by glaring at everyone. Twin sisters who were about 6 years old and never seemed to let go of each other's hands. A teenager named Alex who had been at the orphanage since he was 3 and didn't remember having a family. As Margaret heated up the soup in their tiny kitchen, she listened to Mrs. Peterson explain the situation. The state funding barely covered basic necessities. There was no money for repairs, very little for decent food, and certainly nothing for the extras that made childhood special. Birthday parties, school supplies, warm winter coats, these were luxuries they couldn't afford. "I do my best, Mrs. Peterson said quietly so the children couldn't hear. "But 12 kids is a lot for one person. Some days I feel like I'm drowning and I'm not giving any of them what they really need." Margaret looked around the kitchen while she stirred the soup. The cabinets were nearly empty. The refrigerator was small and mostly contained cheap, processed food, and the stove looked like it might stop working at any moment. But despite everything, she could feel something in this house that had been missing from her own home for months. There was life here. Messy, complicated, challenging life. But life nonetheless. When she served the soup to the children, their faces lit up with genuine joy. It wasn't just the food, though Margaret could tell they were all hungry. It was the fact that someone from outside their world had noticed them, had taken the time to care about whether they ate well that day. As she prepared to leave that evening, little Joey hugged her legs tightly. "Will you come back?" he asked, looking up at her with hope in his eyes. Margaret looked around at all the faces watching her, waiting for her answer. For the first time in months, she felt something stirring inside her that wasn't sadness or despair. It was purpose. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. I'll be back tomorrow." Margaret kept her promise. The next day she arrived at the orphanage with fresh ingredients and spent the afternoon teaching some of the older children how to make homemade bread. What started as a simple visit turned into something much bigger than she had ever imagined. Within a week, Margaret was spending more time at the orphanage than at her own house. She would arrive each morning after Thomas left for work, carrying bags of groceries and supplies that she bought with money from their savings account. Thomas never questioned where the money was going. He could see the change in his wife, the light returning to her eyes, and he knew better than to interfere with whatever was healing her broken heart. The children began to look forward to her visits with an excitement that broke and mended Margaret's heart at the same time. Little Joey would wait by the window every morning, pressing his face against the glass until he saw her walking up the path. The twins, who rarely spoke to anyone, started following her around the house like quiet shadows. Even David, the angry teenager who seemed to hate the world, began to soften around her. Margaret discovered that each child carried wounds that went much deeper than their circumstances. 10-year-old Beth had been taking care of her younger siblings since she was 5, when their mother abandoned them at a gas station. She had never learned how to be a child herself because she was too busy being a mother to everyone else. Margaret started spending extra time with Beth, teaching her that it was okay to play sometimes, that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders. The twins, Annie and Lucy, had been found living alone in an apartment after their grandmother died. They had survived on crackers and water for 3 days before a neighbor finally called the authorities. Now they clung to each other constantly, afraid that if they let go, one of them might disappear forever. Margaret began working with them separately, helping them learn that they could be apart for short periods and still be safe. David's story was the hardest to hear. He had been in and out of foster homes since he was 6, each placement ending when families decided he was too difficult to handle. By the time he reached the orphanage, he had built walls so high that no one could reach him. He would lash out at Mrs. Peterson, break things when he was angry, and refuse to participate in any group activities. But something about Margaret was different. Maybe it was because she never tried to force him to talk or insisted that he smile and be grateful. She simply included him in whatever she was doing and let him choose how much he wanted to participate. Slowly, very slowly, David began to trust her. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Margaret was helping some of the younger children with their homework at the kitchen table. David had been sitting in the corner, pretending to read a book, but obviously listening to everything that was going on. When 8-year-old Tommy started crying because he couldn't understand his math problems, David suddenly got up and walked over. "Here," he said gruffly, sliding into the chair next to Tommy. "Let me show you. It's not that hard once you get it." Margaret watched in amazement as this angry, defensive teenager patiently explained addition and subtraction to a child who looked up at him with hero worship in his eyes. In that moment, she saw past David's anger to the caring young man underneath, the boy who had been hurt so many times that kindness felt dangerous. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret began to notice changes in herself too. The crushing sadness that had dominated her life for so long was being replaced by something else. She woke up each morning with purpose, excited to see what the day would bring. The children needed her, but more importantly, they wanted her around. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret felt truly useful. Thomas noticed the change too. His wife was laughing again, telling him stories about the children over dinner, planning projects and activities with the enthusiasm she used to bring to everything. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, he took her hand and said, "I haven't seen you this happy in years. These kids are lucky to have you." "I think I'm the lucky one," Margaret replied, and she meant it completely. The transformation wasn't just emotional. Margaret found herself losing weight without even trying. Running after 12 children all day was better exercise than any gym membership. More importantly, she stopped seeing her body as something that had failed her, and started seeing it as something strong and capable of caring for others. Mrs. Peterson began relying on Margaret more and more. The older woman was clearly overwhelmed and exhausted from years of trying to manage everything alone. Margaret started taking over some of the administrative tasks, dealing with social workers and state inspectors, organizing the children's medical appointments, and handling the endless paperwork that came with running the facility. "I don't know what I did before you came along," Mrs. Peterson said one afternoon as they watched the children playing in the backyard. "You've been like an angel sent from heaven." But Margaret knew she wasn't an angel. She was just a woman who had found her purpose in the most unexpected place. The children didn't care that she was overweight or that she couldn't have babies of her own. They cared that she showed up every day, that she listened to their problems, that she made them feel important and loved. The changes at the orphanage began to attract attention from the community. Word spread that someone was finally doing something to help those kids on Hill Street. Local businesses started donating supplies after Margaret approached them with specific requests. The church began organizing clothing drives. Even the school district started paying more attention to the educational needs of the orphan children. Margaret organized the first birthday party any of these children had ever experienced when Joey turned 9. She spent days planning every detail, making a cake from scratch, decorating the common room with balloons and streamers, and ensuring that every child received a small gift so no one felt left out. When Joey blew out his candles and made a wish, Margaret saw tears of joy streaming down his face. "I wish that you would never leave us," he whispered to her later as she tucked him into bed. The words hit Margaret like a lightning bolt. These children had become more than just a way to fill her empty days. They had become her family. She loved each of them with a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. When David got into trouble at school, she marched down there and advocated for him like any mother would. When the twins had nightmares, she was the one they called for in the middle of the night. When Beth worried about her future, Margaret was the one who assured her that everything would work out fine. Thomas started joining her at the orphanage on weekends, bringing his tools and skills to fix the endless list of things that needed repair. The children adored him, especially the boys who had never had a positive male role model in their lives. He taught them basic carpentry, how to throw a baseball properly, and how to treat others with respect and kindness. One evening, as Margaret was putting the younger children to bed, 6-year-old Annie looked up at her with sleepy eyes and said, "I love you, Mama Margaret." The words stopped Margaret in her tracks. None of the children had ever called her that before, but hearing it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She realized that somewhere along the way, without even meaning to, she had become exactly what she had always wanted to be. She had become a mother. Not in the way she had originally planned, not through pregnancy and childbirth, but through love and choice and daily acts of care. These 12 children needed her, and she needed them just as much. They had found each other at exactly the right moment, when they all needed healing and hope and the kind of love that only comes from truly belonging somewhere. 5 years had passed since that painful wedding day when Margaret had walked down the aisle to whispered judgments and cruel stares. Now, as she stood before the town council on a crisp October evening, she was a completely different woman. Gone was the timid, broken person who had hidden in her house for months. In her place stood someone confident, purposeful, and absolutely determined to fight for the children she loved. The council meeting was packed. Word had spread quickly through the small town that Margaret and Thomas were making a formal request to adopt all 12 children from the orphanage. People who had ignored the orphanage for years suddenly had strong opinions about what should happen to those kids. Margaret had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She and Thomas had saved every penny they could, working extra hours and cutting back on everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Thomas had drawn up detailed plans showing how they could convert their property and the orphanage building into a proper family compound. They had letters of recommendation from teachers, social workers, and community members who had witnessed the transformation at the orphanage, but most importantly, they had the support of the children themselves. Each child over the age of 10 had written a letter to the council, explaining in their own words why they wanted Margaret and Thomas to become their legal parents. Even David, now 19 and technically aged out of the system, had written a passionate letter about how Margaret had saved his life and given him hope for the future. As Margaret looked out at the crowded room, she saw faces from every part of her past. There was Mrs. Johnson from the grocery store, the woman who had made cruel comments about Margaret's weight and infertility. There was Mr. Miller from the bakery, who had once turned away little Joey for trying to pay with bottle caps. There were former classmates, neighbors, and even some of the wedding guests who had whispered about her on what should have been the happiest day of her life. But she also saw new faces, parents whose children went to school with the orphans, and had seen how much happier those kids had become. Business owners who had donated supplies and witnessed firsthand the changes at the orphanage. Teachers who had watched formerly struggling students blossom under Margaret's care and encouragement. The council chairwoman, Mrs. Bradley, called the meeting to order and invited Margaret to present her case. As she walked to the front of the room, Margaret felt a moment of nervousness. Then she thought about 12 children waiting at home, probably huddled around the old television, wondering if this meeting would determine their future. That thought gave her all the strength she needed. 5 years ago, Margaret began, her voice clear and steady, I was a very different person. I thought my worth was measured by what I looked like or whether I could have biological children. I was wrong about both of those things. She went on to explain how she had discovered the orphanage, how she had started volunteering, and how those 12 children had become the family she never knew she was meant to have. She talked about Joey, who had gone from a hungry little boy trying to buy bread with bottle caps to a confident student who tutored younger children in math. She spoke about David, who had transformed from an angry teenager into a young man preparing for college with plans to become a social worker himself. These children don't need someone to rescue them, Margaret said, looking directly at some of the skeptical faces in the crowd. They need someone to love them, to believe in them, and to give them the stable home they deserve. Thomas and I want to be those people. When Margaret finished speaking, Mrs. Bradley opened the floor for public comment. Margaret braced herself for criticism, remembering all too well how this town could turn against someone who was different. The first person to stand surprised everyone. It was Principal Williams from the elementary school, a stern woman who was known for being tough but fair. I've been in education for 30 years, she said, and I've never seen a transformation like what happened with these children after. Mrs. Rose got involved. Kids who used to come to school hungry and withdrawn are now engaged, happy, and helping other students. If that's not proof of good parenting, I don't know what is. One by one, people stood to speak in support of Margaret and Thomas. Dr. Harrison, the pediatrician who treated the orphans, talked about how their physical and emotional health had improved dramatically. Coach Reynolds mentioned how several of the older children had joined sports teams and were thriving. Even Mrs. Peterson, now retired but still deeply concerned about the children's welfare, gave a tearful speech about how Margaret had brought life and hope back to that old house on Hill Street. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Johnson, the same woman who had made cruel comments at the grocery store years earlier, stood up with tears in her eyes. I owe Mrs. Rose an apology, she said, her voice shaking. I said terrible things about her when she was going through the hardest time of her life. I was wrong and I'm ashamed of myself. What she's done for those children, what she's done for this whole community, shows the kind of person she really is. We're all better because of her. The room fell silent as Mrs. Johnson sat down. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes, not just from the apology, but from the realization of how much everything had changed. When the council voted, it was unanimous. Margaret and Thomas were approved to adopt all 12 children, with the state agreeing to provide ongoing support for the transition. The room erupted in applause, and Margaret found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations and support. 6 months later, on a sunny Saturday in April, Margaret stood in her backyard, watching the most beautiful chaos she had ever seen. The adoption had been finalized the week before, and all 12 children now legally carried the last name Rose. They were having a celebration barbecue, and the yard was filled with laughter, music, and the sound of children being children. Thomas, was at the grill, flipping burgers while teenage Alex helped him and shared stories about his plans to study engineering in college. The twins, now 11 years old and much more confident, were teaching some younger kids how to play hopscotch. Beth, at 15, was helping organize a game of kickball while still managing to keep an eye on everyone like the natural caretaker she had always been. David, now 20 and working part-time while attending community college, was pushing little Joey on the tire swing that Thomas had built the previous summer. Watching them together, Margaret marveled at how David had gone from an angry, isolated teenager to a protective big brother who would do anything for his family. The yard was full of neighbors and friends who had come to celebrate with them. Many of these were the same people who had once whispered cruel things about Margaret, but today they were genuinely happy to be part of this celebration. Children from the neighborhood played alongside her kids, and parents chatted with Margaret and Thomas as if they had all been friends for years. As the sun began to set, Margaret found herself sitting on the porch steps watching her family. Joey, now 14 and almost as tall as she was, plopped down beside her and leaned his head against her shoulder. "You know what, Mom?" he said, using the name that still made Margaret's heart skip a beat every time she heard it. "I'm really glad Mr. Miller wouldn't take my bottle caps that day." Margaret laughed and wrapped her arm around the boy who had started it all. "You know what, sweetie? I'm glad too." Later that evening, after all the guests had gone home and the children were in bed, Margaret and Thomas sat on their porch swing, exhausted but happy. The house was quiet except for the occasional sound of someone getting up for a drink of water or calling out from a bad dream. "Do you ever think about what people used to say?" Thomas asked, taking Margaret's hand in his. Margaret thought about all those wedding guests who had whispered about the fat bride who didn't deserve love. She thought about the people who had suggested that maybe it was better that she couldn't have children. She thought about all the years she had believed those voices and let them define her worth. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but then I look at our kids and I realize that every single thing that happened, even the painful parts, led me to exactly where I was supposed to be. I wasn't meant to be mother to one or two children. I was meant to be mother to all the children who needed me most." As if to prove her point, the front door opened and Annie, one of the twins, appeared in her pajamas. "Mom, I can't sleep." "Can you tell me a story?" Margaret smiled and stood up, ready to do what she did best, be exactly the mother her children needed her to be.